What's up, guys? Welcome to the Wisdom of Coaches podcast, hosted by the Legacy Track Club. Coach Rabo and Coach Falting here, as always. Coach Falting, how's it going?
I normally say I'm living the dream, but currently this dream is painful. I strained a muscle over the weekend and got 2 shots in the back yesterday, some pharmaceuticals to help with dulling the pain. And now I no longer feel like I'm being stabbed, but I definitely feel like I've been a couple of rounds of somebody using my back as a punching bag. So, but we're going to make it. So.
I've been there. You know me. My back goes out about once a year or so. So I feel that the back is always not a great one because there's not a whole lot. If it's an arm or a leg, you can kind of isolate those. But your back, there's just not much you can do to kind of take the pain off of that. So.
Yeah. You sit, you lay down, you stand, every which way. You feel something in there and stuff. But I'm doing a lot better, and I'll be back at it in no time. I've gotten pretty excited about my workout regimen, and so looking forward to getting back in the gym as soon as I can get this to go away.
Back at it, pun fully intended. Well, on the note of injuries, that's actually our main topic for today. So we're kind of getting here about halfway through June. So I guess about a quarter of the way, getting close to a quarter of the way through summer break for a lot of individuals, those who are high school in particular and training for cross country. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about, probably the bane of most coaches' existence, are runners' injuries. You have runners who have come out who maybe took some time off. I know last time we talked about the importance of making sure everybody was healthy before they got started. But a lot of times we have, maybe newer runners who are joining up who ran in junior high or just coming out for the first time. And so quite frequently we run into high school runners getting injured during the summer or maybe going a little bit too hard in the summer and then picking something up in the season, which is always a terrible thing for both the runner and then the team as well. So I want to take some time today to go into a few little things that you use and some things that I've been reading that we can impart on our listeners to help them with just staying as injury-free as possible. So how about your team? How's everything been going with them?
I can tell you we've had some great training the first couple of weeks of the summer, but we do get some injuries, and I can tell you kind of the most common ones that we see, and then some of the things that I think people could improve on. I'll tell you the very first thing. Any kid that comes to me with a minor pain, I've got a little knee pain, I've got some shin pain or my calf's hurting. The first question always is, how old are your shoes? And we had 3 minor injuries with kids going into week 2 of the season, and each of them had shoes that they had worn last cross country season on. And so you could have the meeting all the time. Like I have a parent meeting before we get started that says, hey, the one thing you can do to help your kid is get them a pair of shoes to start fresh with for the summer, get them another pair for the season, and then get them another pair at the end of the season, and we'll be pretty well off, So it's not a huge deal, but something you definitely want to invest in. And I think people just don't understand how shoes work. I think people pick up a shoe and look at it and it still looks clean or nice, and so they're like, this shoe's fine. But the structural integrity on the inside of that shoe, after 300 or 400 miles, it's no longer doing what it was designed to do. And so I would say that's the first thing that we deal with. And then before we started the show, you said you had discovered a little factoid about running shoes. So I'm going to turn that over to you.
That's right. Yeah. I was going to say you need to tell your parents not to just buy their runners 1 pair of running shoes, but actually they need to buy their runners 2 pairs of running shoes. So this is something that as we always talk about. We're both going on and reading online a bunch about things. And so just an article I came across. And this is something that I just naturally do as someone who has an affinity for running shoes and is always buying different trail shoes and road shoes. And, I have big cushy Hokas and I have carbon plated racers and I have, just about everything in between. And so by design, I'm typically wearing a different pair of shoes every day. But this is something that I've kind of known, but now there's some research that is kind of backing it. This was actually a sample study where they took 264 runners. And so of those runners, those who rotated their running shoes had a 40% reduction in injury risk. So coming in pretty close to half there. 264 isn't a huge sample size, but that is still, I would say, not insignificant in terms of this. So, just by telling someone, hey, if you can go out and spend another 60 to $100, you could potentially cut your risk of injury in half just simply by having another pair of running shoes. And there's a lot of different research into this. One, as you kind of mentioned, the internal structure of the shoe. A lot of times we don't really necessarily get to see that. One thing you should be doing if you're a parent or an athlete is taking a look at the sole of the shoe. And a lot of times you can see the wear pattern on that. And so if you've kind of worn that down to where it's smooth in spots, it's pretty likely that you have worn that shoe past its life. But more than the external, shoes have foam in them. Almost all shoes, they're going to have some type of EVA foam, or there's a couple of different types. I know the EVA is kind of the most popular. But that foam gets compressed every time you wear it. And so if you wear it 2 days in a row, that foam really doesn't have the time that it needs to kind of spring back to its original structure. So if you have 2 pairs and you're rotating it, you're giving that foam extra time to spring back, which can give you a little bit more reduction in the forces as you're hitting the ground. And then the other thing is just, I would say don't go buy the same type of shoe. Try to get kind of 2 different shoes, 2 different brands, or 2 different models, because one of the big things that they think really is lowering that injury risk is 2 different shoes are going to produce slightly different gait patterns, which are going to recruit different muscles, which are going to make it where you aren't overusing those same exact muscles every single time. You're recruiting a little bit different. So if you're, a big fan of the Kinvaras and you go and buy 2 pairs of Kinvaras, you're probably not getting, you're giving the foam a break, but you're probably not getting that difference in gait pattern. Whereas if you go and buy yourself a pair of Kinvaras and then go buy yourself a pair of Endorphin Pros or something like that, you're going to get a little bit of difference. So that's the big thing that I came across that I would highly recommend. You talked about runners having shoes from the previous season. I highly encourage people to track the mileage on your shoe. It's something I build into my training log. Is when I get a new pair of shoes, I have a Excel training log that I log everything in, and I have a tab that's just shoes. And so I add the shoe on there, and when I run 3 miles in the shoe, I put 3. And typically most running shoes you can get somewhere between 300 to 500 miles out of before it's probably going to get to the point where you need to adjust. Particularly once I get to about 300, those shoes are now going to be light duty, if anything. I'm probably not going out and doing a 10 or 15 mile run in a pair of shoes that has 300 miles on it. I might use those just for some easier days, 3 or 4 miles where it's not going to beat my legs up as much. And I can really feel a difference in a pair of shoes that has 350 miles on it than I can in a shoe that has 50 miles on it. So track those. That's a big thing because, your athletes, they could very easily put in 300 to 500 miles in the summer. Then, so they almost need another pair of shoes. And that's the other part of having multiple shoes to rotate is kind of, you get, I know it's a bigger cost up front, but then instead of, using up 1 pair of shoes with 300, now you have 2 shoes that have 150 and you're able to keep going. And this way, to me, you can shop sales and things like that. You can find some shoes when they're on sale that your athlete likes, and you can go ahead and purchase those a little bit ahead of time, and then they can hold on to those for whenever they need them, or they can add them to the rotation. There's nothing wrong with having 3 or 4 pairs of shoes in your rotation, especially if you're doing doubles or something like that. You may actually need 4 pairs of shoes in your rotation to make that work. So that's a big one, I think. It's something I come across. A lot of times injury prevention stuff requires a little bit extra work, which is, always been the bane of runners' existence. We love running. We don't necessarily like doing all the other little things, the warm-ups, the cool-downs, the weightlifting and stuff like this. This one is simply a financial investment. All you got to do is shell out a few extra bucks, and you can probably cut your risk of injury in half.
Right. And I'll follow up too with that as saying, Pricier isn't always better. The most expensive shoes on the market right now are the carbon plated shoes. Those are not the shoes that you want to be doing your everyday runs in for any purpose at all. Those are the shoes you want to save for races or a particular type of workout. They've shown some studies that show that carbon plated shoes have caused like small stress fractures in like the navicular bone of your foot if you get continuous use in those. So when you go out shopping for a good pair of trainers to train in, don't buy the Ferrari. In this case, you want something that's a little more economical, for you. And economical cars get you a lot of places a lot easier. They're a little bit easier to fix than those foreign model cars and stuff. So you need to get you just like the Chevy of shoes. So something good with a good amount of foam for your mileage, away from the carbon plates, and something that feels comfortable. And then, yes, if you can find 2 pairs of shoes you can rotate through, there's a lot of injury prevention that can come from working all the little bitty muscles that are in your feet and legs, and switching pairs of shoes is going to enable you to do that. The other thing you talked about, you use the word as it relates to shoes, but it's a good segue to the other type of injury that comes up a lot, and that's overuse. All right. An overuse injury occurs when you do too much too soon, and maybe you're not strong enough to be able to do that. And so if you're increasing your mileage too fast, you could create a lot of problems, like winding up your IT band, putting some stress on your ankles, knees, shins, those kind of things. And so when you're starting to train for your cross-country season or your marathon season, you need to understand that there's a progression to this. And even if you're training with people that are farther along than you are, you need to keep your kind of progression going, not jump ahead to somebody else's. So what we do in our program is we try to grow your mileage about 5 miles a week when we're starting. And we put a really big emphasis early on weights and weightlifting in a way to prevent injuries, and a lot of injury prevention items that we can do. And again, kind of like your shoe talk about mixing up pairs of shoes to work things differently. We're actually piloting a different kind of weightlifting program for us this summer, where we're doing circuit training, where we've basically taken a look at all the muscles that are used by a runner. And we've created a circuit that enacts use of weights to attack each of those muscle groups. And we do it in various ways. So on Tuesday, we have 10 muscle groups that we isolate and work through with a set of exercises. And then on Thursday, we come back and we isolate the same muscle groups, but do a different exercise to attack those. So maybe you're doing like the dumbbell bench press to work on upper body on Tuesday. And then on Thursday, you're doing push-ups. Maybe you're doing one-legged squats on one day, and the other day you're doing goblet squats. Okay. Maybe you're doing good mornings for your hamstrings on one day and Nordic curls for your hamstrings the next day and stuff. And so the idea is that we're going to address all those muscles to make sure there's no imbalance in muscular development, but we're also going to address them in such a way that if part of it doesn't fire in one exercise, it'll fire in the other exercise on the other day, so that we can capture all these things. And the idea is, if you build up mileage while you're building up strength, you're going to avoid those overuse injuries, and you're also going to get muscle balance so that you're stronger when it comes time to run, 45, 50, 55 miles in a week. Your body's prepared for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much positives in both of these, gradually increasing your mileage, making sure that you're not doing too much too soon, too fast too soon. Most of the times in my running career, when I've had something like shin splints or stress fractures or anything like that, it's because I've been just trying to go, increase my mileage way too quick. And it's kind of like a catch-22 a little bit. Like your aerobic system will actually develop a lot quicker than your musculoskeletal system when it comes to this. So you might feel like, oh man, I can go out for 8, 10, 12 mile run. Like, I'm not breathing that heavy. I'm okay in that regard. But if you haven't done the work to kind of condition your bones for that, they haven't been loaded properly, that's easily where you can run into some issues of shin splints, stress fractures, and things like that. Because your musculoskeletal system is just not prepared to handle that kind of beating over and over again. And that's where the strength training comes in. Loading those bones up and is going to help make them more dense, which is going to make them stronger, which is going to lead to less issues there. And then just strengthening the muscles a lot of times will really help with the injuries that you're experiencing, especially if they're joint related injuries. I know I had runner's knee a couple of summers ago, and I was going in and getting some dry needling and things like that. And it was really just kind of reactionary, I would say, to fixing the problem. It wasn't actually addressing it. It was just trying to kind of heal it a little bit. And a few months later, kind of was running into the same thing. And so I went and saw a friend who was a physical therapist, and he had me doing a lot of strength training stuff, very quad based, to kind of really build up those muscles around the knee and take some of that pressure off the knee itself. And some of that was some imbalances, and something was a little weak. And so whenever I was taking a step, maybe my knee was dipping in just a little bit, and that was leading me to have some knee pain. And so really focusing on these different things, focusing on these different muscle groups that we're using as runners can really help alleviate a lot of those injuries that we're going to see, whether that be overuse injuries or whether that be something from just muscle imbalances.
Well, and I'll say this too, it's very hard for any of us to be just highly efficient runners. When you look at some of the best runners in the world, they've had a lot of time to be coached on form because running is their job, And so I remember reading Alberto Salazar's book about him pouring sand on the track and looking at how Galen Rupp's footprints were left in the sand so he could look for any minuscule imbalances to fix it. We don't have that luxury typically as runners. And so what happens is if your running form is slightly off of what the most efficient is, and you're comfortable running, you are getting those muscle imbalances. And a lot of these injuries come from us not understanding that maybe you're quad dominant. Your quad has taken a lot of the forces. And so you're starting to get some atrophy, in your glute muscles or hamstrings or something. And so when you have to call on those for maybe running uphill or downhill or something like that, they're no longer firing the way they should be firing because your quad has been taking all the load for all this time. And so that's kind of the theory behind how we're doing our weights this summer, is to make sure that, you try not to be one muscle dominant over the other, or that if you are, that other muscle is still getting worked so that when you need it, it's there. And I think that's a big deal for runners to understand. You might feel great running right now, but not understanding that a change in environment could cause you very quickly to be injured because of what you don't know is going on in your body, And so, I would strongly encourage that. We had a runner the other day that, was running really, really fast downhill. We went to a really, really hilly place, and some of his teammates had kind of left him, gotten ahead of him. And so he thought, well, downhill, it's always a pace where you can pick up some speed. And so he did. It caused him to kind of overstride to compensate for that. And then you start to learn real quickly what muscles are working the right way and what aren't. And so he ends up having some MCL pain on the interior of his leg. And really that came down to his quad wasn't strong enough to kind of keep that, MCL in place to where it wasn't getting all that strain. So him overstriding and trying to push the pace down that hill took a toll on him, And so now this week we're having to kind of, relax and ease him back into things. I'll say this as well. A huge mistake that runners make, and this young man made this mistake as well. When you're hurt, just stop running. All right. You get on a bike for the next day's training, go swim for the next day's training, but running through pain just produces more pain and eventually gets to the point where you're losing real days of training and real days of fitness. Last year I'd get a phone call once in a while. I was like, well, coach, this started hurting, but after the long run, it was really hurting. And I'm like, why on earth would you do the long run? At that point, understand that, we talk a lot about consistency being the way to be better at distance training. You're a more consistent runner. If you get injured, if you hop on a bike for a day or two and let it heal up and then continue running, versus I tried to run through pain and now I've got to sit out for a week, and let this thing truly heal because I made it worse, And so So I would just say, be aware of those kind of things. It's okay to do something different to heal from an actual injury and keep moving the needle forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Cross training is such a big thing. It's something that I always shied away from early on, and it's something I've come to realize is such a great tool for not only being injured and doing, but also supplementing running in the way. A lot of people, we talked earlier about like people wanting to do a little bit more and they do too much too soon. If you want to do a little bit extra, hop on the bike, hop in the pool. Those things you can add a little bit of aerobic fitness to your life without adding the pounding of running. To go along with some of that stuff you're saying, I 100% agree. There's different forces and different surfaces, especially, cross country. A lot of the stuff we're doing is going to be dirt, it's going to be grass, it's going to be trails, and I fully believe in varying the surface can help so much. Just going from running on concrete to running on grass to running on a track, running on a trail. These things are going to work different muscles. If you're running on the road all the time or a treadmill or even a track, I had IT injury in high school, and I was just constantly running one direction around the track all the time. And that was just causing a little bit of an imbalance because guess what? You're only leaning a little bit to your left, and that was causing that right IT band to just, kind of get tight because it was getting stretched and it was overcompensating. And so the doctor was like, run backwards on your warm-ups, go clockwise on your warm-ups. And it's just like, oh, like this one little change really helped out when it comes to stuff like that.
Running lane 8, get a less stressful turn on your body.
Both. That's what I do now. I run in lane 8, backwards on my warm up so that I'm even out further. But things like trails, things like even the grass. Your foot's just going to land. Most of the time, unless you're running, even a lot of football fields, there's going to be some slight variations where your foot's going to hit, your ankle's going to be a little bit different one way, and then it's going to land. It's going to be a little bit different others, and it's going to work those muscles a lot differently, and it's going to build a lot more resilience in a lot of your joints and things like that. And even one of the things that I've kind of found shocking and something I talked to a lot of people about, in the first 100 I did, it was I chose 100 in Kansas because I wanted something that was pretty close to sea level, and I wanted something that was flat because I figured that would make it a whole lot easier because 100's easy. And this is
100 miles, listeners, not 100 meters.
That's right.
He's being facetious with the 100 is easy.
Yeah. So I, it was an old railroad trail, which is where they take an old railroad track, they tear all the stuff off, and they turn it into a footpath. So basically 50 miles out, 50 miles back. And so you were running, it was kind of crushed limestone, but it was just a flat surface. And, I wound up at mile 78. I had some other stuff going on that summer where that was when I had the runner's knee. I wasn't getting the train quite like I should. But what wound up happening is I developed these massive blisters on my heels and on the balls of my feet. And it just got to the point where I could, every step I was wincing. I could barely stand without just tears in my eyes. And eventually led me to just calling it quits. I just couldn't do it anymore. And that was a very tough thing. But I've done several ultra since. I've done a trail 100K. I've done a trail 100. And I haven't had the same issue, and people always ask why. Typically a lot of people get more blisters on trail, and I tell them, on that 100 on the path, I was landing the exact same way every single step because there was no variation on surface, and maybe my shoes were a little bit too big, one other thing, but that was creating that same friction over and over and over and over. And that's the same thing a lot of times when it comes to these injuries, where if you're, hitting something the exact same way over and over and over again, then you're going to wind up with an overuse injury. You're going to wind up with an imbalance that starts becoming ingrained in you. When I'm doing this stuff on the trail, I'm landing such a variety of ways, going around rocks, roots, things like that. Sometimes landing more on my toes, sometimes maybe outside my foot. I haven't had any feet blisters from these. And so I think that comes back to this as well, varying the surface, varying a lot of these different things it seems like such a minor thing, but it's going to be more interesting to the runner. If you're just running on the road or running on the track or doing the same thing every single day, that's mentally boring. But at the same time, it's going to be a lot better for them physically as well as it's going to be mentally.
Right. I agree. And I will say this, speaking of imbalances, one of the number one things that we try to put in our program for injury prevention is a lot of balancing things. Okay. Do a lot of exercise that involve balance. And I tell kids all the time, you need to celebrate the wobble. So like when you start to kind of stumble a little bit while you're standing on one leg, or your ankle starts to twitch a little bit, all those things are really good ways to like stimulate all those ligaments that are in those joints and make them stronger. Okay. Because sometimes it's hard to address those little parts of the knee and the ankle and stuff. But if I'm doing, what we call the runner's pose, which is a single leg RDL with no real weight, but you're, leaning forward and coming back and staying on one leg. Every time you wobble, you're giving your leg a chance to kind of like drill into it that like, hey, these ligaments are going to get stronger. They're going to hold my knee in place. We do things where you stand on one leg and with the other leg, you try to like spell out the alphabet. And their kids wobbling all over the place. And I tell them, man, just celebrate the wobble because a lot of that balancing technique that you're learning is strengthening so many things in your body that you couldn't get any other way, and stuff. And so by the time that, you can handle doing a lot of things, single-legged, get on a wobble board, those kind of things. But as you get stronger and do that, it just shows that like everything you need to function correctly in your leg is stronger and ready for you to go.
Yeah. And this is another one of those things, where I made the comment earlier, a lot of runners don't like doing these injury prevention things because it's just added time. You're brushing your teeth in the morning and night. Stand for 1 minute on one foot while you're brushing your teeth and then stand 1 minute on your other foot while brushing your teeth. And so you're going to probably get a little bit of that wobble just standing there. And again, it doesn't have to be something that you're taking a bunch of time out of your day to do, but you can just work it in the small little things where, oh, let me just do this. I'm building up a little bit of ankle strength, a little bit of knee strength, like you're saying, these tendons, these ligaments that are, having to work a little bit extra as you're picking up your dominant leg or your non-dominant leg. And you'll find very quickly which leg is dominant whenever you start doing some of these things. One will be kind of planted, and the other you'll be very shaky on. But absolutely, it's just going to help you down the road because running is just jumping from one foot to the other repeatedly. And so I think that's a big part of any injury prevention, any strength program is there's got to be some single leg stuff in there because we're not running on both feet at the same time. We're back and forth one to the other. And so we really have to work those muscles like that so that we're getting the most out of them.
Right. Well, I mentioned, getting a young man injured on the downhill, and I heard you had some discussions about downhill running taking place that maybe you wanted to throw into this particular episode.
That's right. Not only do we coach high school athletes, we also coach a lot of marathoners. And there's some news that's been a little bit of a shakeup in the marathon world. I know I've had some my marathon friends group chats shooting stuff back and forth. And of course, it's all just making things a little bit more difficult for some of us. So a lot of you may recall in the winter, I did a downhill marathon, Mesa Marathon, and we did talk about a little bit, and this is something that kind of plays into your athlete. You kind of have to train to run downhill. It's not something that's very easy. And in fact, if you don't practice it, something like a downhill marathon will absolutely destroy you. I mean, it's not something that's easy. And so I made a kind of I wouldn't even say a bold prediction. I think it's probably whatever the opposite of bold is, a very bland prediction that I bet a bunch of people are now going to go and do downhill marathons because of the increased Boston standards from last year to this year. Boston shaved 5 minutes off of just about all the standards. So male under, I think 35 used to have to run 3 hours. Now they have to run 2:55. I used to have to run 3:05. Now I have to run 3. And so, some of us probably thought we were being a little slick by going and doing a downhill marathon. And Boston has come back and said, not so fast, gentlemen and ladies. And so I believe this is going to go into effect for the 2027 Boston Marathon. Let me pull up this article I had saved. So I think in my case this time around, I would be actually, starting with the 2027 qualifying window. So I have technically qualified for 2026 by a whopping 5 seconds. I'm under no illusions that I'm actually going to go get to run the Boston Marathon with my 5 second. They're still predicting probably about a 5-minute cutoff, they think, which, again, why didn't you guys just drop it 10 minutes then? But I get that, that would probably actually make it too harsh, and then they wouldn't get paying customers coming to the race. And at the end of the day, it's all about the almighty dollar, not really about us runners. So, but Boston came out and they have added a new thing, which is going to penalize runners for running downhill courses. And so the first cutoff is a net downhill of 1,500 feet or more. You will get a time adjustment of 5 minutes added. So if you are a 29-year-old male and you decide, you know what, I'm going to go out and I'm going to run this downhill race and I'm going to run 250 and I'll be under the cutoff. Congratulations. If it's more than a 1,500 foot net downhill, you would now have a 255 and you are not under the cutoff any longer. If it's more than 3,000 net downhill, it's a 10-minute addition. And then I believe when they said, 45 or maybe it was 6,000, more than 6,000 will not be eligible. So if it's between 3,000 and 6,000, 10 minutes are added. More than 6,000 will not be eligible. Couple of thoughts.
Are there a lot of marathons that drop 6,000 feet net? In the
I had a list somewhere that was showing there was one that did, and then there's a whole series called the Revel series. I don't know if that is what they absolutely specialize in, but they have a ton of downhill marathon races. And so I've had some friends in my group who have done the same thing as I have. I, in fact, got the idea from a friend of mine who had run 320 numerous times and needed to run 315. And then he went and did the Ventura Marathon, which is another downhill marathon, and he wound up running 310, and he got into Boston and got to go run a couple of years ago. And so he did another one that was actually in Utah, I believe, and it started at like 10,000 feet, and it dropped a lot. And he said it was actually so steep at the start line that they couldn't have porta potties there. And so, and he said that he actually didn't run as well on that one, he said, because it was so steep that it actually just really destroyed his legs, and it made it very difficult later in the race because of how steep it was. And so, I think if you have a race that drops 6,000 feet, you're very likely just tearing your legs up so much that running a fast marathon time is going to be difficult. But, there's some weird things with this to me, like, if you go and run a marathon that drops 1,400 feet, you're fine. If you go run a marathon that drops 1,500 feet, it's a 5-minute penalty.
See, that sweet spot of 1,499.
I'm wondering if we're going to have some of these races trying to change up their courses. I don't know how many are probably right there on the cusp or pretty close. Although, I did Mesa, and I saw one website actually listed Mesa as a course that would be with that 5-minute addition. And I went back and looked, and basically any way you split it, there's no way that could be the case. It's saying net downhill. And so I was trying to there's a couple of different ways you could look at that. One is where the course starts and where the course finishes, which is the definition of a net downhill. So essentially, if a course starts at 2,000 feet above sea level, right, finishes at 500 feet above sea level, that's a net downhill of 1,500. But Mesa starts at 2,000 and ends at 1,100. So it's not technically even 1,000 feet. So I'm not sure why that one ended up on there. But even then, Mesa gains 200 feet in the middle. So I don't know, maybe they were like, well, we'll add that 200 because then you're coming back down that 200. So maybe they were going, oh, it's a 1,200 foot loss, but that still doesn't add up to the 1,500. So it'll be very interesting kind of seeing where this goes. I'm imagining again, they're seeing the massive increase, I'm guessing, in people going and doing these downhill races, inflating sometimes a little bit. And so I imagine you're going to have a lot of these that either drop in their starts, the amount of people starting, try to adjust those courses to where they're just coming. I guarantee you we'll look up in 2027 and Boston's going to roll this out again to where if it's 500 foot, then it's a 1 minute penalty. If it's 1,000, it's going to be a 3 minute penalty or something to that effect, which Boston's an 800 foot net downhill course. So I kind of find that funny to a certain extent.
Well, I'm not a marathoner, and until I started coaching, an elite marathoner, I kind of thought that race was stupid because I was like, man, the first guy that did this died, and then we named him after him and kept going. But I guess my question is, Boston's going to accept, 20,000 people or something to go run at it, and they're going to make a ton of money off the entry fees and all of it. Like the town's going to make a ton of money off of people coming to stay there for, a few days and those kind of things. Like, I mean, the city's completely transformed by this event. They're going to bring in their elite runners to go and race for what you're going to see on the TV that matters. So I guess my question is, what does it matter if, a guy runs downhill to get their 320 standard and goes to Boston and runs 325. Did that cheapen the Boston Marathon for anybody? Last year it was so hot, people were running way slower than their qualifying times to get in there. You know what Boston still did? Made a fortune off of that, and they still had elite runners out in front that everybody watched and everybody got news articles about. So I don't really understand, and they're never going to accept everybody that meets the standard anyway. So what does it matter?
Well, and it comes down to, so I know last year, again, I qualified and my standard was 305. I ran 303 at Houston, which I'll very likely be back at Houston since it's a flat course and was pretty fast. And so qualified, minute and a half. You wind up having to run about 7 minutes faster than your qualifying time. So I would have had to run almost 258 flat in order to qualify with a 305 standard. I think Boston allows something in the neighborhood of I'm probably going to be a little off on this, but I think it was around 26,000 runners got in, and I want to say something like 36 or 37,000 runners qualified. And so, to your point, they claim that they have someone come in and essentially look at the width of the streets and the course and all of that information, and they assess how many runners can be in the race and it be safe with wave starts and all that. Because even there's waves starts for every runner. I think there's 4 different waves, not including the elites and the not wheelchair races, but the para races and things like that. And so, and that's not including, they have, I think, about 10,000 charity entries where people are raising money to get in and things like that. And that's one of the first things they'll tell you is oh, you can still come in and do the charity entry, raise $10,000 or whatever, and then we'll let you pay us $500 to come run Boston. And so my guess is with this is they're trying to get that number, because I'm sure that they have a bunch of people who get upset and annoyed that they qualified and then they didn't get in, and so they're probably trying to get that to the point where it's they're never going to get 1-to-1, right? They're never going to have 25,000 people qualify for 25,000 spots, but they're probably trying to get it a little bit closer. And then now I'm sure what they're seeing is there's probably some people who are, let's say we have a 45-year-old man who has to run 3:15 now, I think, and he goes to Houston and he runs 3:10, which would probably be enough to get him in. And then you have, some other 45-year-old man who goes to, the Tucson Marathon, which is a downhill marathon in December. I'm not sure how much it drops, but probably a lot. And that man runs 3:05 on the downhill course. Well, he's going to wind up bumping potentially the guy who ran the 310 on the flat course. And so I'm guessing they're trying to make it quote unquote fair so that people who they feel did this correctly as opposed to running a downhill course are getting in and not being pushed out by someone who just decided to go run a downhill course to shave off a few minutes. I'm not entirely convinced that a downhill course really gives you that much of an advantage in the grand scheme of things. After having done one myself, I definitely ran a little bit faster. I don't know how much of that was actually because it was a downhill course as opposed to just me getting a little bit more fit, because I definitely felt like the downhill portion of that race was mostly the first half, and then it was pretty flat the last half, and my legs were really shot the last half. And so I almost feel like if I just just in there just another flat course, I could have run just as good, maybe even quicker, because I wouldn't have quite destroyed my legs as much.
Right. To me, I think like a very, very low grade decline would be a great thing. That's not what's happening on these.
No.
And so, I mean, running downhill, you're constantly either having to overstride to allow gravity to keep carrying you, or you're having to every footstep kind of hit the brakes a little bit to keep gravity from just, sending you down the hill. And so those things both cause a lot of wear and tear on your body. You've done the Pikes Peak ascent and descent. And then I've got, one of my other close friends does the Hot Springs peak to peak. He'll tell you, like, I hate running down the first mountain more than I hate running up the second mountain, because the downward hurts more than the up.
Yeah.
And I think people just think, because you can roll a ball down a hill and it'll pick up speed and run fast and everything. That's how the human body works. And it's like, if the body wants to roll down that hill, it sure can gain some speed and stuff. But if you want to keep from rolling, you're constantly having to use muscles in a very different way that does a lot of wear and tear on your legs and stuff. And so to me, I think you would need a very, very low grade downhill for you to reap the benefits of being in a downhill marathon.
Yeah. It's a sliding grade, I think, on two parts. I think the grade part you're talking about, and I think the distance, like you could probably go run a 5K on just about any grade, unless we start getting too crazy, and you're going to run a lot faster than you would running a 5K on flat ground, mostly because that 5K is going to be over in probably 20 minutes or so, give or take 5 minutes for most people. And so that's really not enough time. And you may be sore after, but that's not really enough time for that muscle to really get too crazy. Just looking at something on my computer. It was like a lightning strike, and then something popped up on my computer and was saying it was overloaded. So that might be fun. And I think a 10K.
We keep it interesting on this podcast.
That's right. A 10K something, a half. And of course, like the further you get and the steeper you get, the more that's going to, affect you. And so, but they have a downhill mile world record, and it's not something as crazy as you would think it is. It's faster than the actual mile world record, but it's not like someone's going out and running a 2:58 downhill mile or anything like that.
I also doubt that mile was dropping 6,000 feet in the 1 mile, because dropping more than a mile downward as you're running a mile, or anything like that. Again, I think
the incline. I'm going to do the incline at work with some friends in 2 days, and that's you in 0.8 you climb about 2,000 feet, and so. There's records up and down the incline. I know some people were asking me about this yesterday. Actually, our old compatriot Persant was messaging me, asking me if I had done it, and then asking about some records. And I was like, yeah, the record up this is 17 minutes. And you think about that. Falting, I know for a fact, you and I could go out and walk a 15-minute mile on flat ground without too much difficulty in the grand scheme of things. And then, this is climbing 2,000 feet, and it's not even a mile in 17 minutes as record. But, going down this, and this is maybe not the exact best example because this is stairs and the stairs aren't uniform and stuff like that. But the fastest time down, that's 8 minutes. And it's actually like a 60-year-old guy we all call Crazy Bob for obvious reasons. And so, I mean, you figure like, the only way you're getting down that much faster is if you just jump. So I don't know. I think it's a very interesting.
Like at the end of the John Wick film.
That's it. Aim for the bushes. It's other guy's reference. Somebody was talking about that the other day. So yeah, I think this is an interesting. I see the logic behind it by the BAA. I think it's kind of, I don't want to say half baked, but I do find it funny that if you go and run something that's 1,499 feet of loss, then you're fine. And if you hit 1,500, all of a sudden, that's a 5-minute penalty is incurred. So I imagine at some point they'll have to revisit that and make some adjustments. But just interesting. I think it's gonna shake up some races. I bet there were some downhill races that had some really good turnouts this year that are about to hurt a little bit more next year.
Well, I'm sure the next thing is if you wear alpha flies, you get a 2-minute penalty. If you wear vapor flies, you get a 1-minute penalty. Where does it end?
Yeah, exactly.
To me, we're in an era where people are finding ways to move fast. Let's just celebrate it and let them move fast, and figure out a way to work with it. But that's just me.